Okay, ladies, welcome back to the second part of the Chapter 4 Making Markets Work, Business Objectives and Pricing Decisions. We just talked about perfect competition and the way in which revenues, etc., might be affected. But now we're going to take a look in this instance at the way in which revenues are affected in imperfect competition, which is essentially like the type of competition that we're sort of more used to in the real world examples, for instance. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a couple of examples then. Okay, so in this instance, in imperfect competition, we've always got a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, but in this instance, the demand curve is also the average revenue curve. Okay, so effectively, remember, average revenue is basically total revenue divided by output. Well, in that case, that clearly is giving you your price as well, isn't it, effectively? Okay, so if we then take a look at our marginal revenue curve, then, okay, it's going to fall more steeply than the average revenue curve. And that's because essentially to sell an extra unit of output, the firm has to lower its price, and it means that essentially it has to do that for all subsequent units as well, which then causes somewhat of an issue. Okay, but if we take a look at that and just bear in mind that the marginal revenue will always be significantly less than the average revenue, the total revenue overall. Okay, so in this instance then, okay, we've also got, again, remember we're showing revenue per unit as average revenue and marginal revenue, but we're also looking at total revenue in aggregate terms. Okay, so we've essentially got here a situation where if we're starting to get to the point where the amount of revenue that we're generating is actually starting to fall, or our marginal revenue is starting to fall, you're going to tend to find that over time, then revenue is going to start to peak. It will peak at a certain point, okay, and that's where our total revenue is maximized. But then, if our marginal revenue is above zero, then for each unit that we sell, we're going to get it's going to add to total revenue. Okay, but when we start to get to a situation where we get negative marginal revenue, then total revenue is going to fall. Okay. So in terms of this principle, then we've also got to bear in mind that the elasticity of demand is going to be slightly different in perfectly competitive markets. Okay, so we've got a situation here where effectively, if we take our existing demand and average revenue curve, then effectively at higher prices, you're going to tend to find that prices or demand tends to be more elastic, and as a result of that, when we look at this overall curve, that we have elastic demand at this higher price. As you can see, essentially the gradient is significantly steeper, but as we start to get into a lower price, then effectively you tend to find that it becomes more inelastic in terms of the effect that a change in price has on the level of demand. When we then start to look at marginal revenue, if we bring marginal revenue into the debate, if you like, we've got this scenario where we've got this price elasticity of demand is price elastic, and when marginal revenue is positive, but as essentially we get to a point where we get to price being inelastic, we're going to tend to find that marginal revenue is going to start to become negative. Okay, and the reasons for that is essentially, again, if we think about what we're saying, the marginal revenue is the amount that we're receiving for each unit, that extra unit that we sell. Well, in this instance, as we get further down towards price inelasticity, then obviously that means that the amount of demand is going to be significantly the difference in demand for a change in price is going to be significantly less. Okay. If we then take a look at that in a little bit more detail, then, okay, we've got this scenario where we've got elasticity and marginal revenue. Sorry, I'm clicked on one too many, is being shown in the graph here. Okay, and in this instance, we've got our price elasticity of demand is price elastic, with total revenue rising and marginal revenue is positive. But when we start to get to pricing elasticity, with the total revenue is falling and our marginal revenue is negative. Okay, the next slide, you don't really need to know this. I think this is a little bit more detailed. It isn't really covered in the spec, but if you want to take a look at it, obviously you can take a look at the reasons for that, where we got the marginal revenue curve falling twice as steeply as the average revenue curve. But fundamentally, we know that there's this relationship between marginal revenue and average revenue, and that if marginal revenue is increasing, then average revenue is also doing the same, and vice versa. Okay. So if we're talking about imperfect scenarios, then again, looking at this explanation and this connection between average revenue and marginal revenue, if we've been given the information that we've got average revenue for the first item is 20, and average revenue for two items being produced is 18, we can see that in this instance that's going to give us a certain pattern. So in this case, we've got our average revenue at 20, our total revenue at 20, and clearly our marginal revenue, the amount that we get for producing that particular unit is 20. Okay, where we've got average revenue at £18. Okay, remember, to get our average revenue, we're taking the total quantity by and then in this case timesing it by 2 to get a total revenue of 36. The marginal revenue in this instance is the difference between our two total revenue figures, and so we've got 16 as our marginal revenue. Okay. Then our average revenue comes down to 60, but our total revenue is still increasing at 48, and our marginal revenue, the amount that of extra revenue we're generating, in this instance is 12. And you can start to see that this pattern emerges to the point where when we got a quantity of 6, if our average revenue is 10, that means that's 60. It means that we're essentially getting no extra marginal revenue from the extra unit produced, and you can see that at 7 units, then effectively we start to get into a position where our marginal revenue is negative. So it's actually it's costing us more to produce, or essentially we're actually not achieving any extra marginal revenue. In this case, the additional revenue produced for producing one extra unit is actually starting to fall. Now, so we've talked a little bit about different types of cost, but we're also going to need to look at profit as well. And we talked briefly about this principle of normal profit, which essentially is, in business terms, break even. Okay, but in terms of how we define that, then normal profit in economic terms is considered to be the minimum reward required for a firm to remain in an industry. Now, we've talked about that from a business perspective and said that actually businesses will need to make profit in order to stay in an industry. But in economic terms, and this is why the theory sometimes sort of starts to be a bit of a struggle to appreciate and understand. That would be, normal profits would be not where you're making a profit at all, but that's where you're covering all of your costs, essentially break even, in terms of business definitions, if you like. Okay, so another way of thinking about it, though, if you wanted to try and sort of justify it in your own mind, is to think about it as classing it as the opportunity cost of staying in the industry is just better than the next best alternative. And if that were the case, then possibly, if you were thinking about it from an economic standpoint, you would choose to stay in that industry if that were the case. If it was a slightly better situation than the next best alternative, then you might choose to stay in that marketplace. Okay, so that's essentially the point at which normal profit is seen. If we're drawing that as on a graph, is the point at which cost and is included in the firm's average cost curve. Okay, so where our revenue meets the average cost curve is the point at which we will be making normal profit, i.e., we wouldn't be making a profit, we wouldn't be making a loss. Okay, so in the long run, any business, any firm will choose to leave an industry. If it can't make normal profit, then it's clearly going to just think, right, I've got a better way in which I could allocate my resources. I can use it to try and generate profit in another marketplace. And so as a result of that, I will choose to take my my resources and choose to work in another market. Okay, every time I move, I get stuck, don't I? So I do apologise for this being slightly truncated in terms of the way we're presenting it, or I'm presenting it. So in this case, normal profit is going to vary between industries and is influenced by the risk involved and any change that people might choose to take on board. Okay. So that's basically normal profit. Okay. Now, another term that you will hear bandied about in economics is something called supernormal or abnormal profits. Okay, and we'll try and explain what those are in a moment. Okay, so supernormal, as you'd imagine, is any profit that's over and above normal profits. Now, we've said that normal profits is essentially where our total revenue is basically covering our average cost, so our average total cost. So in this situation, then, if we're in an economic market and if a firm is seen to be making supernormal profits over and above what you would normally expect, that's going to mean that other firms will look to join the industry if they can. Okay, and when they do that, then obviously that will mean that over time, that supernormal profit that somebody has been achieving, some other business has been achieving at, will over time be competed away. Because new entrants into the market will start to challenge you in terms of cost and possibly quality, etc., etc. And that situation means that in time, any supernormal profit that's been made will actually be competed away. Obviously, the amount of competition in a market will definitely influence the level of supernormal profit that any business can achieve, and also the timescale within which it can do that and for how long it can sustain that. And you tend to find that supernormal profits or abnormal profits tend to be in markets that either have certain monopoly scenarios or some monopoly power. Maybe it could be oligopolistic examples too. Okay, where there's an opportunity to restrict new competition, and that means that in the long run, you could actually maintain that supernormal profit if you've got either a point of differentiation or some monopoly power of some description. Okay. So there is a little test for you to take a look at there. I'm going to leave you to take a look at that, and if you want to have a go at that, please by all means do so. Okay, so using the data, draw, define, and interpret the different revenue curves. And that's not a bad sort of piece of practice to go through and test yourself and see if you can remember some of the formula and also what some of those things are telling us. Okay, let's move on to take a look then. We've talked about various definitions. We're now going to look at different objectives of firms and how that might then influence pricing decisions and revenue generation decisions. Okay, so remember, if we just to sort of remind ourselves, you look down the left-hand side of your slide here, what is profit? Well, profit is basically revenue take away cost. And in this instance, when we're talking about a company or a business that's choosing to profit maximize, okay, that's basically when the difference between total revenue and total cost is at its highest. So basically, we're making more revenue than we are total cost. And in that scenario, clearly, that clearly is going to be a position that some businesses will choose to work at to be profit maximizers. Okay. Again, some other useful definitions there in terms of how we calculate total revenue. It's price times quantity sold. Total cost being fixed cost plus variable cost. And like we said, there's a definition there of what fixed costs are and what variable costs are. So if we look at profit maximization, then this is where we're in a situation where a business or a firm is seeking to try to achieve the highest level of profit available from the production of their goods and services. So that's the first one. Profit satisficing is a slightly different scenario, okay, where you tend to find that profit satisficing goes on where the ownership of a firm and the management of that firm is slightly different, okay, i.e. the owners might be shareholders, but the people who are running the business might not have shares, but they might choose to try to feather their own nest and look after their own sort of work-life balance, maybe to the detriment of achieving profit maximization. So profit satisficing is where effectively managers might choose to work to suit their own agenda rather than just work to the point where they're going to absolutely 100% maximize profits, etc. You can also get something known as sales maximization and increasing market share, where basically the business chooses to maximize sales, and it might be to produce more volume sales to maybe gain more market share and claim to be a market leader, and that also can have an impact and will also could in this case obviously increase the size of the firm. If we could say that we're growing and that we've got greater sales revenue than the next company, then in some situations that might be an objective of senior management, because large businesses tend to pay higher wages than smaller but more profitable ones. And again, if you're motivated, if you're a sales director, for instance, or you're motivated by generating commission and earning more money, then in some cases sales maximization could be something that you as not an owner of the business necessarily, but certainly somebody who's benefiting from sales commission might choose to encourage. And then you've got revenue maximization, okay, where in essence you would seek to maximize sales revenue, okay, and in that case what you're saying is that you will actually carry on producing revenue until you get to the point where marginal revenue, the revenue that's being generated by producing an extra unit, is at zero, okay? And these are all different types of objectives of firms, and some of you will be, I think, probably familiar with some of them, but they clearly will then have an impact on the decision making in terms of the pricing strategies that a business might adopt, and also to some degree where they're going to operate at and what level of output, okay? So looking at an example here then of profit maximization, there's a table of data here which actually demonstrates marginal revenue and marginal cost, and you can see in the first instance output level 1, we've got marginal revenue of 20, we've got marginal cost of 32. So basically at that particular unit of output, that one unit of output, we're actually losing money essentially, and in terms of the marginal revenue that we're generating is lower than the marginal cost. Okay, and you can see that a pattern emerges here, and in some instances there are examples where we get to the point where we're actually doing reasonably well, but you have a look at the information that's been provided here, and then you can see that in the second instance we've again got a scenario where we've got we're making a loss of £4, okay, and this happens at each point until we get to the point of 6 units, okay, and that's essentially where we've got marginal cost and marginal revenue being the same, okay, and dependent on the objectives that you might choose to have, and as we've said before, we've said that in order for a business to profit maximize, that firm will actually choose to increase its output until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. Now, if you think about this point here, if we get to the point where, in this case, 6 units of output, we will carry on producing until we get to that point. Okay, because the argument is that if our marginal revenue is higher than our marginal cost, then actually we might be making a small amount of profit, but as long as that marginal revenue figure is higher than our marginal cost figure, then we will, if we're a profit maximizer, we will carry on producing up to that point. So let's have a look and see. We've sort of just talked about that, but let's try and show how this link between marginal cost, marginal revenue and contribution actually can be demonstrated. So profit maximization occurs when, as I mentioned before, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Marginal cost, remember, we're just going to go through the definitions again. The cost of producing one more unit. Marginal revenue is the amount of revenue that we receive for selling one more unit. Okay, and if we get to a scenario where the marginal revenue of selling an additional unit of product is above the marginal cost, then firms should increase output if they're attempting to profit maximize. Okay, as the revenue received is above the cost of producing that unit, the firm is going to carry on and increase output because it's going to make a contribution towards profit. Okay. If we get to a scenario where the marginal cost of producing the product is above the marginal revenue, then a firm would choose that if it was attempting to profit maximize, it would choose to reduce output, because effectively for every time you're selling a unit that's where the cost is higher than the revenue that you're receiving from it, well, essentially for each unit of output that's produced over and above that, you're going to lose money. Okay, and so as a result, you would choose to reduce output. Okay, so a really important one to remember if we're talking about profit maximization, remember that is always where MC equals MR, where marginal cost equals marginal profit. That is the point at which profit maximization would be achieved. Let's take a look at what that then means. Then, if we show that graphically, okay. So this is a position where if we were a profit maximizing firm, okay. Now you can see profit maximization in this case occurs at Q1, P1. Okay, so Q1 and P1 here. And unfortunately, the drawing isn't absolutely 100% accurate. It should be right on that average revenue curve, that dotted line, but let's not worry too much about that for the moment. Okay, so that's the point, as you can see, where marginal revenue and marginal cost cross. Okay, but in this scenario, where we got a situation where we're able, because there's still enough demand for our goods and services, okay, we can actually sell, even though we might be producing at this marginal revenue, we can actually sell at a significantly higher price because the market still is willing to pay for that higher amount. Okay, so in this instance, the profit is the difference between the average revenue, okay, as we can see here, and also our average cost line. Okay, so where we've got the biggest distance between average cost and average revenue is the point at which we would be producing to profit maximize. Okay, and this yellow shaded line here is basically the difference between our average cost line and our average revenue line, and at that point there, that's the point at which there is the greatest distance between those two. So we would be in the profit maximization point where we're actually making supernormal profits. Okay, let's look at revenue maximization then. Okay, so if we're talking about, in this instance, we're looking at revenue maximization, that would be, when we look at the graph, that's where we've got a situation where Q2, P2 is at the point at which marginal revenue is 0. Okay, so if we increase output over and above that point, then marginal revenue would be negative, and the firm is going to be, if it chooses to produce below this point, is going to have an increase in marginal revenue, and could choose to increase marginal revenue by increasing output. Okay. Any firm achieving revenue maximization is clearly then going to carry on doing that until the point at which the price elasticity of demand is at 1. Okay, if PED was lower than 1, then the firm could increase price and revenue would increase. If it were actually below 1, we could decrease price and then revenue would increase too. Okay. So in this situation then, where we've got revenue maximization, you can see at this point we've got Q2 and P2, and at that point also the that at that point marginal revenue is going to be 0. Okay, so as soon as we get to that point of Q, then effectively our marginal revenue is going to start to fall in terms of and will become a negative figure. Okay, and if we increase the output beyond that point, marginal revenue would be negative. And if the firm choose to produce below this point, it could increase the marginal revenue by increasing output, a bit like we just described. If we look at sales maximisation then, this is a situation where a firm might seek to achieve the highest possible level of sales without making a loss. That's the principle behind it. Okay. Now in this instance, when we look at the next graph, we're looking at Q3 and P3, where we're at a point where average revenue equals average costs, and that's the point at which sales maximisation would happen. Okay. If we get to a situation where our output is increased beyond Q3, then average cost will be greater than average revenue, and the firm would start to make a loss, and clearly wouldn't want to go any further than that, because it's then not feasible to do that over the long run. Okay, if we get to a situation where output is below Q3, then the firm could increase sales, and let's take a look at how that looks in this instance. Then, so we've got in this case Q3, P3. And you can see at this point, we've got average revenue and average cost at the same point, at the point at which that intersects. Okay, so if we try to do anything over and above that, or anything different from that, we're going to start to put ourselves in a difficult position. So if we increase the output beyond that point, the average cost would be greater than the average revenue, and the firm would start to make a loss. And okay, in this situation, if we're trying to sales maximize, the firm is going to seek to achieve the highest possible level of sales without making a loss. But clearly, it doesn't want to go past the point at which its average cost starts to increase over and above its average revenue. So it's this point here that we would be looking to work towards. You can see in this scenario, though, that there are a number of different positions. So we talked about P1, P2, P3, Q1, Q2, and Q3. In this instance, what we've done is taken each one of those and put those onto the same diagram. So you can see how if it's profit maximisation, revenue, or sales maximisation, you've got how the firm might choose to change its objectives. So obviously, if we change from profit maximisation to either of the other two, we're going to tend to find that price will fall and output will increase. Okay, and you can see that by just running through the explanations over the last couple of slides. But in each instance, you can see that those, dependent on what the objectives of the business might be, that might then choose or cause the business to choose to change price and also level of output to suit their particular objectives. Okay, so if you want to, you can have a go at comparing and contrasting the scenarios we just talked about. Okay, explaining the concepts of profit, revenue, and sales maximisation, and that might be quite useful just to do that based on the info that we've sort of gone through so far during this session. Okay, so if we then, okay, so profit satisficing I mentioned to you previously. And this is where effectively the business is not necessarily about just achieving a profit. Okay, so it could be where maybe the business is still making a profit, but in this instance they may not be producing at a point at which they're maximizing profits. Okay, and in some cases that could be down to all sorts of reasons. It could be down to profit levels being set, and for stakeholders such as shareholders, employees, and consumers, there might be other reasons behind why a business might choose not to necessarily profit maximize. They might choose to use some of that profit to help ethical or environmental improve environmental practices. Okay, but more often than not, profit satisficing tends to occur when you've got this divorce between ownership and control. Okay, so shareholders, the owners of the business, might wish to maximize profits, but managers and directors might have some self-interest. They might want to maximize their own personal benefits to get increased job enjoyment, or to get higher levels of pay or fringe benefits, and that clearly costs the business and might cost profit too. But that's where profit satisficing tends to be seen most clearly in a situation where you've got shareholders who might be owning the business but won't necessarily be running the business. So if they've employed managers and directors to do that for them, you do sometimes find this profit satisficing situation happening. Okay, so a couple of little tests for you to take a look at. Profit maximisation occurs when something equals something. I'll let you have a look at that, look back at some of the slides, have a go and see if you can remember what those formula are. And then also a couple of more questions in terms of what objectives a firm might have, and again, what would this situation be? Profit maximisation, would it be A, B, C or D? So we've covered quite a lot and done it reasonably quickly, but that covers anything to do with business objectives, different types of business objectives that an organisation might have, and also the influences that might have on pricing strategies, and whether you're a profit maximizer or a revenue maximizer or a sales maximizer or a profit satisficer. And that hopefully gives you a good summary of all the things that you need to cover for Chapter 4, Business Objectives and Pricing Decisions. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch up with you soon.